So yes, so if people at home want to ask a question of any of our speakers, then use the chat function to do that. Also, if anybody is here, if anybody would like to ask a question, can you indicate? Can you shout out and then I'll try to repeat it? Right. Can you shout out your question, please? And then I'll try to repeat it.
Do you know where Richard de Montfort was in the run-up to the Battle of Evesham, and how old was
he? Do we know how where Richard de Montfort was in the run-up to the battle, and how old was he?
I'm not sure about in the run-up, but he was in his mid-teens. He wasn't very old at all.
So mid-teens?
Yeah, yeah.
There is one actually.
In particular, May and August. I was just wondering if anybody knew where Richard de Montfort was, because we know very little about him.
Well, there is one fascinating, I think I'll be all right. There is one fascinating thing on this, which is that I think it was at Hereford, Henry III personally authorised a gift to Richard de Montfort of, I think it was of, it was either deer or it might have been of timber, which is an extraordinary thing in that it's what Henry authorises very, very few writs by himself in that period, but he authorised this one, and it's about the only indication of some kind of feeling of the king towards the Montfortians. It looked almost as though Henry was getting on quite well with Richard de Montfort, and also for the gift to be authorised, it rather suggests he might have been in the entourage then. But on the other hand, I wonder if it was more likely that he was, that, you know, messengers, as Louise's wonderful theme shows, are going backwards and forwards all the time. And it may just be that Henry had heard something about Richard at that point. Sounds more likely to me Richard was his mother, don't you think?
Yes.
I don't know.
Yeah.
And he obviously managed to escape. It wasn't an Evesham, was it?
Later, he's associated with pedantry, authorisation of the Later, there's some entries in Eleanor's roll to suggest that he's associated with the siege at Pevensey, because he's authorised to pay some money towards, I think it's the archers there or someone like that. Anyway, but that's later in the summer. Mm.
And just in relation to that, on the chat, there's a question about, do we know when Richard de Montfort died?
No.
No.
He goes missing in 1266, and I think there have been some, there's been a hoard of coins discovered that may have been associated with him, which someone just mentioned to me after a talk once. I don't know any more than that, but he literally just goes missing, I think, in 1266.
Thank you very much. What happened? There's one entry for this block in the bar. So he might Rob, my friend.
Right. Okay. That's David, isn't it?
Yes.
Thanks, David. There's another question just on the chat, which I'll just read out. Sorry, it's quite lengthy, so I can't. This is from Antonia. To what extent was the pacification of England after the death of Simon at Evesham to do with who Edward was? He represented the future of the dynasty and had a personality, charisma to compete with Simon. Also, how important was the death of Simon's supporters in the development of his cult, or not the development of his cult? Sophie, do you want to start, Andrew?
Oh, okay, all right. Was fine. I think Edward is key in helping to bring peace together. There's a big discussion, I think, amongst the royalists, essentially, as to what should happen after Evesham. Should they? There's a group of of lords around Henry, of whom I think Roger Mortimer is one, who basically want them all to be disinherited and extirpated. And there's a lot of disruption immediately after Evesham. You can see that there's a whole series of inquiries afterwards where people go into Montfortian lands and basically take them over, and you get various people afterwards saying, well, I wasn't a Montfortian and these guys came and took my lands away. But Edward seems to be one of those that is in favour of reconciliation. You can see that with some of the lords that I mentioned in my talk, who end up actually in Edward's entourage. But it's an uneasy situation. It's a somewhat understudied situation, the period between Evesham and Henry III's death, and we're all looking forward to the second volume of David's biography, which I think will really shed light on that period. But there are sort of key elements of reconciliation that take place. One is the victim of Kenilworth, which allows the disinherited to buy their lands back, essentially at a premium. Then there is the taking of the cross by Edward in 1268. And then there is the great culmination of Henry's building of Westminster Abbey that David describes earlier in 1269, where the translation of Edward the Confessor's body takes place, and is carried around the abbey by various royalist lords. But even in 1270, there is still tension that is going on between Edward and Gilbert de Clare. Gilbert de Clare is supposed to go on crusade with Edward, doesn't go on crusade. In just a few days before Edward departs, there is a massive dispute in Westminster Hall between two royalists, John de Warenne and Alan Lasouche, who was one of Henry's stewards. They're in dispute over a property, and Warenne murders Lasouche in Westminster Hall, and Edward has to sort of break away from his preparations to go back and sort of sort this out. So there is still this sort of sense of tension that is there, and I think there's very much a sense of actually when Henry dies, that Roger Mortimer is a key part. He's one of Edward's sort of people that Edward leaves behind when he goes on crusade to manage his affairs. Mortimer, Gloucester, Warenne, and other of the lords of England that are there, they get together, they swear that they will uphold Edward's kingship. And there is this long period when Edward is away. He doesn't come back for almost 2 years. But when he comes back, you have his coronation, and there is this big sense of a new beginning. And I'll finish my sort of very long answer of a rather sort of lovely moment at Edward's coronation, where in the aftermath of the feast, they have 100 white horses, and they let them all go, and whoever catches them is able to take them away. And that's a sort of real, I think, a moment of a new beginning, and there is this sense of a lot of the old guard, even those who didn't die at Evesham, have died in the period between 1265 and 1274, when Edward finally becomes king.
Just
David, do you want to?
Yeah, just to add to that, I completely agree with Andrew that Edward in the end helps reconciliation, but actually I think he was completely to blame for the disastrous policy of disinheritance. He was the one person who could have stopped it. He didn't stop it, and actually a lot of his very closest henchmen, like Warren of Basingbourne, absolutely profited from it. So I think Edward is the person who is to blame for that catastrophic mistake, which is, on the other hand, terribly understandable, given I think the eloquent bitterness which Andrew had in his talk. And I sort of feel I'm going to alter a little bit of with the wonderful imagery of the tongue and everything, with proper acknowledgement, of course. But I'm afraid I think Edward was absolutely to blame for that. I'm afraid, it was so understandable. But that in the end, he certainly learned from his mistakes. But don't forget, it was Gilbert de Clare who had to get the dictum modified, not Edward.
Yeah, that's right.
So,
yes, I was just going to just to add to that, I suppose, because so the first part of Antonia's question was about how much of it was down to Edward's personality as well. We talked about this sort of revenge, quite understandably. But the point that Andrew was making in his talk about rebuilding royal authority, that it's the king's job to reform the kingdom, and that it's his job to make laws and to take counsel, but that all of it should be in the king's hands. He had a very good model there for that in Louis IX of France. So Henry III's brother-in-law, Alphonse of Poitiers, one of the younger brothers of Louis IX, who had been doing precisely this in the 1250s, holding anti-corruption inquiries across France under their own steam in order to root out corruption amongst their officials. And this was precisely the point that Louis IX could make in quashing the provisions of Oxford. He could say, look, it's all very well to reform the kingdom, this is a great thing, but it's the king who should be doing it. Said when he heard about the 1264 constitution, I would rather break clods of earth beneath the plough than have a government of this kind. That it's the king who should be doing it.
Just a very quick point, it is worth noting the fact that Edward was able to spend so long coming back from Crusade and visiting his French estates before he bothered to come back to England. This suggests that he was confident that by that stage the rank and disagreement of the war was well over, because he was out of his kingdom for a long time.
Just finally, we've touched on France. It's really something that we haven't really discussed much today, but this sense of an Anglo-French influencing each other, the role of Louis IX. Louis is Henry's brother-in-law, and Henry and Simon and Edward all spent considerable amounts of time in France, absolutely picked up stuff from Louis IX, and he, I think, is a huge influence on Edward France.
David, as you're close by, I'll give you the microphone. You don't mind, as you're close by.
Hello. You mentioned about Edward being away for so long and being confident. Back. When he comes back, when he comes back, there's a conspiracy against his life that Mortimer and Edward, his brother, have got to deal with. Gilbert Clare is conspiring with Robert Ferrers. There's a civil war in Staffordshire, Yorkshire, all the counties in all of England are in disturbance. I mean, he comes back to a mess, really. So, was he mistaken to go away for that long? Because his father's died 2 years beforehand, and frankly, the regents, Merton, Fennell, and Mortimer haven't dealt with it very well. Or is that just one skewed interpretation?
Anytime the king is absent from the realm is always going to be difficult. And so to that extent, yes, you can argue, there are clearly some signs, and you mentioned the dispute between Robert de Ferrers and Edmund of Lancaster that happens. But when Edward comes back, it seems to all settle down. There is a hearing, and then, but when we say, oh, Edward neglected Israel, neglected England. Well, he was in Gascony. And Gascony was very much in Edward's minds, just as important to him as being King of England. He was one of the Grand Seigneurs of France, and these lands mattered to him. And he spent a great deal of time organizing and arranging Gascony. And in the midst of his reign, he's the last English king to visit Gascony in 1286 to 1289. He spends time there. And you can't understand Edward I. You can't understand Henry III. You can't understand English kingship in the later Middle Ages, or indeed any point in the Middle Ages, without understanding that they are lords in France, and that matters to them just as much as being King of England matters. So yes, you can say perhaps in Staffordshire they thought, well, we wish the king would come back, but Edward is doing his kingly and his lordly duty in Gascony.
Just to add to that, it's worth bearing in mind, of course, that Gascony was in a worse state than Yorkshire, or so that's really when he did his attention.
And there's another question on chat, which I think, David, might be for yourself. It's a bit blurred when you're so close to the screen. Am I right in thinking, this is from John T, am I right in thinking that King Henry III executed 300 archers who hadn't actually done anything to deserve it? If so, was that a blip in an otherwise generous and affable life? Or were there other examples of his doing things of that ilk? sorry if I've missed, if that's already been covered.
Well, no, that's completely true in that the 300 archers, this is just before the Battle of Lewes, and they had been sniping at the King's army, and they had killed Henry's cook, who had been riding out in front of the army, no doubt to get the meal ready. And an unprinted chronicle, I think a Franciscan chronicle, says that 300 archers were enticed to surrender by Richard of Cornwall, King Richard, who was in the army, and that they were then executed in the king's presence. Whether that really means Henry looked on, or whether it was in sort of Cor Anrego, sort of in the king's court area, and actually in Flimwell at Kent, which is near Ticehurst, Flimwell, that area. I don't think that. I mean, that is what happens in war, and then at the Battle of Lewes itself, large numbers of commoners were killed. What it doesn't happen in this period is the execution, the killing in war until Evesham of nobles. So no noble was killed at Northampton, and indeed, as we heard, Edward actually rescued young Simon from being killed at Northampton. None of the Montfortians taken at Northampton were killed, they were all imprisoned. Equally, very, very few people were actually killed at Lewes. And when John Giffard on Montfort's side was captured earlier in the battle, he wasn't killed, he was taken off to captivity at Lewes Castle. So I'm afraid chivalry operates for the nobility, but not for archers, townsmen, and so on. And of course, the great change at Evesham was that those chivalric conventions were broken, and hence the title of Sophie's book, The Death of Chivalry in England.
I was just going to say, you can sort of see it from Henry III's perspective, though, can't you, particularly, because this was even before the Battle of Lewes, wasn't it? So it wasn't as if those archers were on safe ground in shooting at the Royal Army. I mean, it's quite shocking when you think about it, really, that they were willing to stick their necks out like that. It's an opportune choice of phrase.
Yeah, I mean, just to reinforce that, I mean, from the king's perspective, they did deserve it because they were rebelling against their king. And as commoners, they come to expect any mercy.
Thank you. Okay, I think we're now sort of going slightly beyond our scheduled finish time, but just a couple of more quick questions, are there?
Hello, just a quick one. It's on the subject of Dante, actually. I work for the museum and we're just about to do an exhibition on Dante's Inferno, and its tenuous links to Evesham, i.e. Guy de Montfort. And I'm just interested in your perspective as to why did Dante include Guy de Montfort, because Dante wasn't born until 1265. So the events at Viterbo would have happened when Dante was a very small boy. Is this part of this whole kind of, would it, because it's such a shocking thing, was that why it was remembered and still talked about why Dante included it? And is it this whole kind of, that you're either a saint or a sinner, looking back at the Trinity Apocalypse and the way that Simon is depicted in that? I'm just interested in what the panel's thoughts are.
I think we have to remember the career of the younger Montfort in Italy that Andrew alluded to as well. So although Dante might not have been contemporaneous with what was going on, we can imagine the memory of their reputation. Is it Guy de Montfort who fights at the Battle of Tagliacozzo in 1268? And there's Italian chronicles describing his great feats of arms and how he rides into battle shouting the Montfort family name. So I think, his reputation in Italy, and he was made Podesta of, I can't remember which Italian town now. He had quite a significant career, so one can understand that memory. But also, as you say, it's such a shocking thing to do. I mean, to go in to a church with swords drawn, and Henry is dragged out of the church, so he's not actually killed in the church itself, which is, I suppose, one way of getting around it. It's sort of, but it ranks up there with the murder of John Comyn by Robert Bruce, Robert I of Scotland, or most heinously, people like Thomas Becket. It's one of the worst things that you can do. So I can understand how that story would linger.
Okay. Is it?
No, it's fine.
I think yes. If we could just.
Just a quick question. We talked about the bishops and their turning upside down of the candles, all supporting Simon de Montfort. So after the Battle of Evesham, how did the bishops behave, and how were they reconciled to the king?
Yes, so they disobeyed not just the king but also the Pope, because the Pope was very much obviously on Henry's side for the restoration of good lawful royal government. So they were suspended from office, the 114 bishops. There's 5 of them suspended from office, and they have to make restitution with the Pope. So they have varied careers. So John Gervase, Bishop of Winchester, has to go to the papal court to make amends. He actually dies at the papal court whilst he's there in 1268. And actually, as a result of that, one of the most famous preachers of the 13th century, Hugh de Chateauroux, gives his funeral sermon describing basically the papal view of what John Gervase, as Bishop of Winchester, had done in supporting Simon de Montfort against the king and the Pope. And he explains it by sort of beautiful arguments and scriptural allusions that sort of God was giving the bishop the chance. He gave him the chance to fall, in that he could then have the chance to get back up again and sort of make amends. So their story really, it's sort of partly, I think it sort of belongs to that aftermath of Evesham that Louise and Andrew talked about. That's really just sort of tragic, actually.
Okay, I'll just finish with one question, and this is to all our speakers, and I'll let you each have a 2-sentence answer. Which is, do you feel an empathy with the individual that you have talked about today, and as well as feeling a sort of empathy, do you feel that person was in the right? So just pass the microphone along quickly.
I feel an empathy with all of the individuals that we talked about today, actually. I think if you put yourself in each of their shoes, you can understand their point of view. So in that sense, yes, I have an empathy with Simon. And you can sort of see his dark charisma and magnetism. But also, a lot of people died. And when you see the tragedy of Evesham and the aftermath, I think that's what sticks.
Yes, I have an empathy with Eleanor. I think she could be quite difficult, but I think she had quite difficult periods of her life. I think she made some imprudent decisions perhaps when she was younger. The vow of chastity, when perhaps she hadn't fully considered its lifelong implications. I think she was quite difficult, but I quite like her for that. And yeah, I have an uneasy relationship sometimes with her after all these years. And I'm sure it changes every year. So we have an ongoing relationship, Eleanor and I. Here's Andrew.
Yeah, I suppose I have empathy with Edward I. I mean, I think he's one of England's great kings in lots of ways, but like Simon, he has a dark charisma as well. He has a dark side, and maybe to a certain extent that's picking up on something that David was talking about earlier. That is one of the things that lots of great kings have. But one of the things I always say to my students about Edward I is he has a huge amount of strengths, one of which is his absolute determination. He's very clever, but what he can't do, and perhaps this is something that all of the people that we've been talking about today would have benefited from, is the ability to see things from other people's point of view. He can't do that, at almost at any point during his life. He finds it very difficult to see things from any point of view other than his own. And that is a strength, but also a big weakness too.
I think the same could be said of Roger de Mortimer, is that he certainly never saw anything from anybody's point of view other than his own. And he was single-minded in the protection of his estate and his inheritance, which was, of course, the prime duty of any medieval noble. But I don't think he went any further than that, and I can't really say I like him.
I won't answer the question directly, but it's a wonderful period working in the 13th century, but I also wish it was the age of Holbein or the age of Van Dyck, because I would give anything to see really what these people look like.
Yeah.